podcast. I am here, my name's Lulu, and I'm here with Maya and our guest, Warren.
Hello.
So, Warren, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Warren Steyn. I'm formerly from South Africa, been living in Tanzania for a number of years. And I'm a beekeeper, and in particular, a stingless beekeeper from the tribe Meliponini, which is a little different to the apis, the honeybee that we know. So yeah, something completely different. These bees sort of only live along the tropical world, and I happen to be living in the tropics.
Very nice.
Yeah.
So how did you get into bees, and how long have you been working with them?
So I've been a beekeeper most of my adult life, mostly as a hobbyist beekeeper with the honeybee, the stinging one. And since having moved up into this part of the world, up in northern Tanzania, where we're very close to the equator, I was introduced to another species of bee. And so in the last sort of 5 years, I've been dedicating my life to this other bee, a bee that doesn't sting.
It's very nice. Do you also work with other bees, or is it just the stingless bees?
No, I do. I do work with the normal honeybee. We have them up here as well, obviously. I use them mostly for pollination services. They sort of outperform the stingless bee in some senses because there's just a lot more of them and they can fly a lot further. But as I said, my focus is with stingless bees at the moment, and the honeybees just come inadvertently, yeah.
Would you like to tell us a little bit more about your project, maybe? Like what is the main goal? We know that you're spreading bees everywhere in a sense. So yeah.
All right. So yeah, in the last sort of 5 years, having been introduced to these stingless bees, there's like sort of a culture of stingless beekeeping up in this part of the world. These bees are sort of high altitude bees. They live on the slopes of both Mount Kilimanjaro and Mount Meru. And yeah, basically our project deals with a network of farmers that have these bees almost domesticated. They can't really defend themselves, much like the honeybee can. So they need a bit more protection. And basically our project deals with this network of farmers. We offer training and support, sort of good beekeeping practice to them. On top of it, we're just trying to stimulate the culture of stingless beekeeping. Basically, it's a bit of a dying culture in that, through habitat loss and things like pesticides usage, there's been a huge decline in bees around the world, as we know. Yeah, basically, we're just trying to stimulate the culture. Also, stingless bees, and we can get into this a little bit later, but stingless bees produce only a very little amount of honey, and the honey's only ever been traditionally used as a medicine. And then since sort of pharmacies, and we call them duka la dawas here in Tanzania, are on every street corner, so the medicinal use of the honey is no longer being used like it was in the past. So yeah, we're basically trying to bring that back into the scene, whereby we're encouraging the use of stingless bee honey as an alternative to sort of Western medicines. Basically, it's all about just getting the culture of stingless beekeeping going again. What we're trying to do is propagate more colonies. How many bees do we have without going into the forests and cutting down trees in order to procure a stingless bee colony? We're trying to actively teach farmers how to propagate their colonies. From one box, we can make another colony. It's not really a viable enterprise, but for what it's worth, their honey alone, from a medicinal value and the fact that the bees do provide pollination, they're very instrumental in our lives up here, keeping the culture going and not letting it die off completely.
It sounds really lovely. It's like it's growing, and it's trying to get away from the, like you mentioned, from the westernized medicines, rather using these natural medicines. They tend to benefit us much better. I really love that.
Yeah, we have Australian stingless bees, and I've had a bit of their honey before, and it's really different from the normal European honey that you buy. So
yeah, it's way more sour.
Yeah, it's weird. But
it doesn't really taste like honey. However, it does taste like honey. It's more like a sweet and sour syrup.
Yes, that's true. So why did you choose to do stingless bees, and is there any like major differences between European and stingless bees?
Well, for me, just the fact that, you can deal with a colony of bees without having to wear a full suit, protective gear is a big plus. These bees are very accommodating. You can open up a box at any time and sort of get your head right in there and take it all in. From an observation point of view, it's really a wonderful thing to be able to see and witness these bees at work, and they don't really seem to take much offense to me opening up their boxes and getting sorry, just going back to what you guys were saying about the honey, that sweet sour thing. It's these bees actually practice fermentation within their hive. They bring in nectar from the flowers, and the nectar has a high moisture content, as it does with all bees collecting nectar. And then in the case of the honeybee, they sort of dehydrate or fan the nectar and blow the moisture off the honey until it gets down to a certain moisture content. Stingless bees do a similar thing, where they dehydrate this nectar into honey, but they can't quite get it down to a point where the honey is the sugars in the honey sort of prevent the fermentation from happening. So basically is a fermented product, and hence the reason why you get that sourness. It's a result of the acidity happening in the honey that gives that sort of sour flavor. So yeah, and obviously as a result of that, it becomes more sort of bioavailable for not only the bees but for us as well. A fermented product, as we all know, sauerkrauts, all these things, they have that sort of probiotic element to them, where it's a lactobacteria fermentation. So we have this lactobacillus bacteria on the honey, and we've subsequently had our honey DNA sequence, and we know that bacteria does reside on the honey itself. So yeah, very good product to ingest as well. Disregard the acidity or sour side of it. It is unique, and and the Australians, as you know, they have a culture of stingless beekeeping for sure.
So then, like stingless bee honey also like contributes to gut health and digestion. So because it's probiotic. I didn't know it was fermented, which was the sourness of it. That is the acidity. That's it's really cool to know, actually.
Yeah, it's amazing how they can keep it to that moisture content too.
Yeah. When you harvest stingless bee honey, do you need to make sure that you harvest it in a specific time frame, or does it just continue fermenting and fermenting until it becomes like very acidic? Acidy?
Acidic. It's a good question, a very good question. We sort of harvest more in line with our seasons. Up here in the tropics, we have a short rain and a long rain season. So we have a tendency to harvest sort of later in the year, October, November, December, are the 3 months that we harvest. And that has nothing really to do with at what point the honey is at. The most bees, when honey reaches a certain moisture content, they seal off the honey itself. So in the case of the honeybees, they got the little cells, and the honeybee fans the moisture off the honey. And then when it gets to about 18%, that the bees cap the comb. This is the honeybee, the stinging bee I'm referring to. And in the case of the stingless bee, they seal off that honey pot. So once the honey is reached a certain moisture content of around 25%, they then finish off building this pot. So when we're harvesting October, November, December, it's just on the back of the short rain season. There are flowers about, and the bees are still bringing in nectar. So there are some pots that are still open and haven't quite reached that moisture content whereby they will seal off the pot. So we don't really concern ourselves with at what time, considering yeah, it's a good question, because the honey sits inside these honey pots, and the pots are made of propolis, which is a substance that exudes from trees, and a bit of detritus, like particulate that the bees collect. But they basically make these wax propolis pots that house the honey inside. And for whatever reason, the propolis has a lot of antimicrobial properties to it, so it kind of preserves the honey in a way. The honey doesn't continually ferment. It actually sort of presses pause on the fermentation process, but the honey, as it is, if you open up these pots, has little bubbles inside of it. So it is still very active. Now, obviously, honey, as we know, if you expose it to environmental conditions, it's hyperoscopic. It pulls in moisture content, so that would increase activation as well. We harvest October, November, December is because we need the bees to recover January, February, March, April, before the start of the long rains, which are around April, May in Tanzania every year. So we prefer to harvest earlier in the season and then have the bees recover, collect resources so that they can withstand the cold and rainy winter that we have.
That's very cool. So they have their own they seal it off before it gets too acidic.
Yeah, kind of. You know, it's a lot. There's a lot we don't know what goes on within a hive, and in some cases we see a lot of activity within the honey pot. They're very bubbly and got this sort of foam cap on, much like a beer. Now that could be to do with what type of flowers. There are a whole lot of variables there, that flowers bring in this very active honey and others don't. So, but for whatever reason, the propolis pots seem to sort of control that fermentation process to some extent. It doesn't continually ferment to a point where it becomes vinegar. It always retains itself as a honey. It just becomes increasingly more acidic over time, but at some point it's sort of stables out and never ever turns to vinegar within the hive. So, and those bees are obviously, utilizing the matured honey and using it for themselves when the weather's not great, or they're using that honey with a bit of pollen to feed the larvae. So pollen is the protein to feed the larvae, and then the honey is the carbohydrate. So basically, it's a food source for larvae development as well as for bees when the weather's bad. They can't go out to sort of forage, and they can rely on their own stores, much like with the honeybee as well.
Cool. So what kind of hives do you use? And also Lulu mentioned that stingless bees don't have the usual hexagonal kind of typical bee thing. So
comb, yeah. Yeah. So the honeybees build a comb, as we probably have all seen in our lives, with little hexagonal cells. The stingless bee builds a pot, much like, I always think of Winnie the Pooh, basically, like traditional honey pot, as it were. This is just a very sort of oblong egg-shaped cell that's made out of this propolis and wax medium. And within the hive, there's a whole lot of pots. Some of them are holding the honey and others are holding the pollen. So two separate resources that they store in these pots. As for the type of boxes that we use, we're not as advanced as the Australians. They have a way more complex type of hives, more sort of to facilitate hive duplication. So you guys have got these sort of square boxes. They're called an oath hive, and they're made up of multiple layers, and basically you can break the hive open, and what you would find when you break it open is you'd have a bit of resources on the one side, as well as half the brood, the nest area, and the other side would have that as well, and then you can basically separate them and create another colony. we use just a rectangular shoebox, something very simple, really. It doesn't really sort of help us much when it comes to hive duplication, because we have to forcefully go in and break open the nest area in order to separate brood to make a split. But it's more of a traditional method. In fact, going back to traditional methods, here in Tanzania, we have the log hives. So just a log that's been split down the middle and a cavity created on either side of the half. And one of the beauties about a log hive over here for us is it's really thick. So, it can withstand temperature fluctuations outside. The log hive, the only problem I see with the log hive is that the log ultimately deteriorates, which means they have to collect these resins from the trees and seal off any gaps. So you can imagine if there's a gap, the bees would have to seal off that gap with this propolis. Whereas if it's just a shoebox, a wooden box, it sits very close by. There's a very little gap that they have to actually seal off. So basically, it's just a more of an advanced method. But again, there's pros and cons to both of them. If that explains that.
Yes. I have a quick question about the traditional kind of aspect. So in Tanzania, is there much of a history around beekeeping?
Yeah, I mean, Tanzania is has a huge culture of beekeeping. We have these huge areas in central and southern Tanzania where we have these forests. They call them the Miombo. This is home to bees. If you look at the sort of, there's two schools of thought where bees come from, but one of the evidence strongly suggests that bees sort of came originally from Central Eastern Africa. So we at the home of bees.
That's cool.
Obviously, when it comes to beekeeping as such, farming the honeybee, the stinging one, and the industry is huge.
I'm enjoying this so far. I've actually learned a lot.
I didn't know that, I never really thought about where bees came from before. I was just like, yes, bees.
Same. It's also one of those things that's just like, it's everywhere. I never really thought about it.
So are there heaps of different types of stingless bees?
Yeah, so across the world, there's something like somewhere between 500 and 600 different species of stingless bees that produce honey and live social colonies, but they mostly reside along the tropical world. So, for example, in Central and South America, there's many hundreds of them. By far the largest sort of diversity of stingless bees. Here in East Africa and Central Africa, we have, I think, about 20 odd different varieties. To sort of Southeast Asia, Singapore, Malaysia, Australia as well have quite a number, but nothing compared to that of the neotropics, the Central and South America. In Tanzania, we have, I think, about 7 different varieties.
What about in coastal regions? I know that we have stingless bees here. I've only ever seen one specific type. They live in our roof and in our chairs and in a drawer that you haven't opened in a while, and pretty much everywhere where it's not very easy to access. But do stingless bees also like to live in coastal regions?
Yeah, absolutely. Here in Tanzania, we have about 3 different, or even more, maybe as many as 4 different species of bees that reside along the coast. The one is very, very small, and they produce that long sort of tunnel entrance. They call hypotrigona. So you do get bees that reside along the coastal area. Very much bees that sort of target mangrove type habitat, but very small bees, not an economically viable bee to farm as such. They produce only a very small amount of honey, but I think in terms of what they provide from a pollination service point of view, very, very good, because there's a great number of them in the colonies. So those very small bees, there's as many as 5,000 to 10,000 bees within a colony, Whereas the bees that we keep up here, you'd only find, maybe up to 1,000 bees in a colony. So it becomes a bit of a numbers game.
Do honeybees and stingless bees pollinate differently? Do I don't know, do stingless bees pollinate more flowers or different flowers, or how is there a difference there?
Yeah, very good question. Stingless bees are in their size a lot smaller than the honeybee. So if you have a flower with it really depends on the flower, but in the case of stingless bees, they can access almost any flower just because of their size. So you can imagine the floral diversity is, bees are generalist foragers. They go out and forage whatever nectar source is available at the time. And in the case of stingless bees, being able to access a different shaped flower compared to the honeybee, it has a greater range of resources available to itself. So yes, stingless bees can get into flowers that the honeybee can't in general.
So you mentioned that there's the types that like mangroves. Are there any other types of plants that the stingless bees prefer?
Yeah, like I said, they're very generalist foragers, and up where in our part of the world, we sort of reside up against the national parks at high altitude, and these huge stands of forests. The range of floral resources available to these bees is extensive. Here on Mount Meru, where I live, we live in a sort of agroforestry environment whereby we have big trees, then we've got agriculture underneath it, which is normally the banana, coffee, and a variety of other botanicals. So yeah, basically they're generalist foragers. Whatever's happening at the time, they're likely to target, provided it can provide them with a resource. So yeah, to answer your question on specifics on terms of what species of trees and flowers the bees are attracted to, it's very general, and that's the case for most bees as well, in terms of just being generalist foragers.
Cool.
Yeah, but so I can expand on that a little bit. I mean, in the case of the pollination services that I do with honeybees, we like most pollination service sort of operations, we bring the bees into the flowering resource, whether it be avocados or whatever. In the case of avocados, for example, we introduce the bees at a certain time for when the flowering avocado has reached like sort of 5 or 10%, we introduce the bees to that flowering avocado, and the bees exhibit a fidelity towards that flower. Whereas if you bring the bees in and they're resident bees there, they're likely to go and forage and find their foraging resources elsewhere than actually target that flower that's flowering at that specific time. So you can force bees to pollinate flowers by introducing them into the crop at a certain time.
That's very interesting. So there's a type of also methodology behind it. It's not only have bees here and then everything will be merry. It requires a little bit more planning and thinking than that.
Yeah, absolutely. I just think that in general, to give you an example, or maybe share a little story with you guys, there's a couple of farmers that I deal with on West Kilimanjaro that have a great number of bees around their properties. So great that you wouldn't be able to think that the forests in the vicinity would be able to handle so many bees. And it's quite extraordinary. Guys get a honey crop off their bees for that many flowers or that many trees in the area. These bees don't fly. Stingless bees have a range of up to maybe a kilometer, so they can't really fly a lot further than that. So if you take a sort of if you take that range around where the bees are and you ask all these bees to go out and forage, and they're able to come back and produce excess honey for you to harvest from, it just goes to show that we can do with a lot more pollinators in our homesteads to service the flowers and the trees in the vicinity. In other words, the carrying capacity, what we know, can be greatly expanded on. We could have a lot more pollinators. So I encourage people to never, sort of concern themselves too much with having too many pollinators in their gardens. These examples show us that we can have a lot of pollinators and they can still thrive.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at a garden, you can never think, there's too many bees in this garden. So yeah, but you did say at the start that habitat loss is affecting them, and I was wondering if climate change also had an effect on the numbers of stingless bee populations.
Yeah, look, for us over here, the effects of climate change are not seen as radically here where we live, compared to some other parts of the world. But certainly, like habitat loss, I'd say, is the biggest thing. We're somewhat fortunate around in these parts where we have these sort of pockets of protected areas, especially the national parks on both these volcanoes that these bees reside on. So we're very lucky in that sense. And then also just living in a tropical environment, we consistently get our short rains and get our long rains. And living on the mountains over here as well, we have our own sort of climate that's, as a result of living on a mountain, I guess, and living in the tropics. We live in a very lush environment whereby there's continuously floral resources available for the pollinators. So yeah, I can't really say about climate change much in terms of that affecting us over here. More habitat loss, whereby trees are being cut down indiscriminately, and that's just a loss. It's a loss for the bees. It's a loss for the tree providing a home for bees in some cases as well. As I said in the beginning, the thing with stingless bees is that you can't put out a catch box like you do with the honeybees. You put out these boxes and you catch feral swarms. Stingless bees don't readily move into a catch box. Well, in our case here, for certain, we have to actually duplicate them physically. So we actually have to open them up, take out some of the brood, take out some pollen and take out some honey, and try and create a split, try and create another colony from an existing colony. So when we have habitat loss, when people cut down trees because there's a stingless bee nest in the tree and they want that nest, well, the whole tree is the whole tree sort of dies as a result of that. So we can't get that back.
What I've noticed here with back to climate change and affecting bees, I haven't really noticed it with stingless bees. However, our residential honeybees, we have 2 beehives in our food forest, and our neighbor has bees, and there's just wild colonies, a few wild colonies of bees hanging around them in flame trees, and with these super irregular weather patterns that we've been experiencing recently, and in the past, 20 years, weather patterns have changed drastically here. That might be affected. We're on an island, but it's definitely also influenced by climate change. What happened this year, last year, and the year before is that between March and May, which is it's very hot, and usually there's not much life going around in the bush as everything is dried up. The past 3 years, our short rains that we get in January and February have been scattered or non-existent or too short, so that the bush and the flowers and the trees, they don't actually bloom. So this year was worse. The worst one that we've had so far is the bees would invade our house in search of something sweet. So we would have a whole colony of honeybees in our kitchen all day. So what we've actually had to do is we've had to make little like honey pots outside, like in the bush, and then whenever you would pass by there, you would just see these swarms of bees hovering over it, or plates of sugar water when we ran out of honey. So
Yeah.
The fact that they're not getting enough food because the trees aren't making flowers because of the irregular weather patterns, probably influenced by climate change. So that's the only change that I've noticed here. However, I haven't really noticed it with the stingless bees, but once in a while you do get the occasional swarm of stingless bees in the kitchen as well.
Really? Wow. Yeah, shame. They're desperately seeking out something to feed on.
Yes, and they're very friendly. However, then at some point you've just got all of these bees crawling around on the floor. So walking around either means you're going to squish them with shoes on, or you're going to get stung into your feet, which is both not a very happy ending.
Yeah. No, I'm sure they're friendly. I mean, it's a sort of misconception with bees. People see bees and they some people tend to freak out. But when bees are foraging, they got nothing really to defend, as opposed to you invading their hive. They're just out there to forage. They're not on their defense.
I was wondering, so honeybees have predators like birds, bee eaters, and such. And I'm not sure what other insects eat bees. I know that some spiders do, and their nests also their hives get infested by moths and ants and larvae. Does that also happen with stingless bees? You mentioned earlier something that they are, they're not able to defend themselves as much. But I was wondering about nest raiding from other species
and also mites as well. Like that's been a bit of a problem in Australia with European bees, but I'm not sure about stingless bees.
Yeah, so I think first, like the biggest pest that we have are ants in our part. They can invade a hive and do a lot of damage. But yeah, like I was explaining, the bees seal down their hives very well with this propolis, resinous substance, so that they only have one entrance. But yeah, the stingless bees definitely get plagued by the same sort of pests that the honeybee does. And in our part, it's the hive beetle, and then also the wax moth, which are one of the two biggest problems with the honeybees as well. But these bees do very well to defend their nests because they can't sting, but they use this propolis as a means of sort of embalming down any invading creature. So an invading insect would need to come through the entrance of the stingless bee colony. It would need to run this gauntlet, which is almost a tunnel made out of propolis. And within this tunnel, there are these little wet propolis droplets that the bees can grab at any time and use it to embalm, like literally stick down the ant or the beetle or the moth to a point where it can't move around anymore. And then at some point it dies, and then they break it down and dispose of it outside. So they do very well. Their defense methods are very good in that they can defend themselves without the need of a sting. But in saying that, it really comes down to the strength of the colony. If the colony is in good shape and in good health and have a lot of numbers, as in bee numbers, they can then protect the entrance. In other words, a stingless bee colony, if you walk up to a stingless bee box, you'd always see the little guard bees around the entrance, guarding for any other bee wanting to come in and maybe take honey. Or I mean, it's all pheromone based, but the bees recognize another individual that comes from that box and then allows them inside. But yeah, very, very good sort of strategy around protecting and defending themselves, provided they're healthy and strong.
That's very cool. Very cool. So they've got their little sticky bombs.
Little sticky bombs, exactly. It's a good way to describe it.
So in our household, we don't really use conventional medicine. or just generally supplements. However, when we do get sick, we take these little propolis capsules to boost our immune system.
Yeah.
Is there a difference between honeybee propolis and stingless bee propolis? And is there a difference in power, or I don't know, healthiness? Does that exist? No, it's just different. But are there very like deciding and large differences? Do you know?
I can't say with certainty. You know, there's a lot of research now around propolis, propolis extracts, and taking raw propolis. Propolis has many different compounds within it. Now, I can't see there being much of a difference, though, when the bees, comparing the honeybee to the sting bee, when they go out and forage for propolis, that there's going to be any difference there necessarily, other than the secretions that come from the bee themselves. So the bee, the stingless bee has these mandibles, like almost jaw-like structures on their mouths that they use to sort of break off the propolis, and then with their saliva can sort of transfer into a bit more of a sticky perspective. The difference, I can't say with certainty what the differences are from stingless bee propolis to that of the honeybee propolis, other than the bees are different and will have different sort of bacteria around their salivary glands that manipulate these sticky to a point where they can use it to, disinfect their hive. Or, I mean, basically the resin is used as a disinfectant, right? So in the case of a stingless bee box, if you open it up, you'll see it's lined with a propolis resin, the whole inside of the hive. So nothing can really grow on there. No fungus can grow in there, or other bacteria can reside on there. It sort of inhibits these other microbes from taking over. And then in the case of stingless bees, they use it to build these honey pots as well, and their what's called an involucrum, which is the nest waxy propolis substance that surround the brood chamber. But yeah, again, I can't say with certainty which propolis will be better for you. I can say, however, that there's a bit of a misconception around propolis with stingless bees. People seem to think that they don't really collect much propolis, but I beg to differ. I think stingless bees are incredible propolis collectors. If you leave a lid of a box open a little bit, or in the case of those log hives I was explaining, and they need to seal off these entrances, they seal them off rather rapidly. So they're very efficient at collecting propolis from trees and using it within their hives. I'm just to expand on propolis a little bit. I'm experimenting quite a bit of propolis these days. I'm making a tincture using a fruit grade alcohol, and putting it into these little tincture jars with a pipette, just to support immune health. And yeah, I think what we'll understand in the future with propolis that it has amazing capacity to heal certain diseases, or just to generally support one's health. So yeah, I'm very excited by propolis and where we're going in the future with it. Obviously, there's a lot of trials that need to be taking place, human trials for that matter. But certainly when it comes to any injuries or any topical sort of problems on the skin, propolis and stingless bee honey both are amazing in terms of sort of skin or wound health, the ability of a wound to get better.
Absolutely.
That's interesting. I hope the experiments go well.
Thank you. Yeah.
Do you have any tips for anyone who would want to start doing stingless beekeeping?
I'd have to say that again, in order to start, you need to start from someone that has stock of bees. I know in Australia, there's quite a bit of trade going around where one can purchase a stingless bee colony from an existing farmer. And that would be the way forward. That's what I would suggest, other than, in finding a stingless bee colony in a tree and cutting it down. I don't think that's the way forward. But yeah, stingless bees are commonly referred to as pets these days. They're very much domesticated for those that have them, and they're wonderful things. They're wonderful things to observe. Tips, just look online, do whatever research you can. Obviously, depending on the species of bee, they require a certain box or a certain hive shape or a certain manner in which you would maintain those colonies. Tips. I guess it's a difficult question, in terms of how far you want to go with this hobby and understanding the bees and the science around how they perform. But certainly just embrace it. embrace the bee.
Embrace the bee, and the first permaculture principle: observe and interact. So if you have stingless bees in your local area, look at how they're living, and then try to see how you can implement or imitate that so that they feel comfortable, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what's lovely about observation and stingless bees is the fact that you can, without needing protective gear or anything like that, you can open a colony and you can observe. And then just watching the entrance of the beehive, you see these little girls flying in with big pollen loads on their corbicula, which is their hind legs. They've got these almost like an indentation in their hind legs where they carry these pollen and resin propolis loads. And it's lovely to see, if you're seeing bees coming in and out of the hive, carrying these loads of pollen, that there's some flowers about that are basically, in that transformational stage where they are, they're wanting to produce either a fruit or a seed, or it's just being a part of nature, really, to understand what's going on in your environment just by watching what the bees are bringing back to their colonies.
Great.
Well, thank you for coming and talking with us today. I found that really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, so did I. I learned a lot, and I hope that our listeners as well.
It's an absolute pleasure, guys. Absolute pleasure.
Yeah.
keep it real.
Yeah.
And I mean, certainly, you guys can ever get your hands on a stingless bee colony and have it nearby. They really are wonderful insects to observe, and just I mean, it's a wonderful thing that so often is the case that we don't pay attention to the smaller insects of our world. It's always the big animals and big creatures that sort of take the limelight. But stingless bees and bees in general, pollinators in general, I think have a huge role to play, more than we can imagine. So if you ever can get involved in beekeeping, please, I encourage it.
Asante sana.
Aya, nashukuru, asante.
Be great. Bye.